we're about Middle Ages on last week's episode. Well, it's not an episodic type of thing yet, at least, but for now, it's probably just going to be a 2 or 3 part thing in 1 to 2 hour increments, about depending on how long the conversation takes. And we're going to move on to. We did the Stoics. We talked about that. We talked about like Seneca the Younger, Epictetus. Maybe one thing we didn't mention was that there was a lot of similarities to like Eastern Buddhist thought and the idea that life is suffering. Well, maybe we did say this, but there seems to be like some fundamental principles there, I think.
Do you?
Sort of me thinks. Yeah, there's this term that shows up, Greek word, although I think it might have been Roman as well. I mean, of ataraxia, which means like a state of unperturbability or unperturbed. It means like basically just a state of like equability and serenity and calmness, which pretty much I could see how that sums up a lot of Stoicism. Yeah. So moving on to Roman theologians, current era mystics, such as Saint Augustine of Hippo, Roman statesmen such as Boethius.
Who is he? What's up with Augustine? I need the background there.
He was about 480 BC, I believe he was born.
480?
Yeah, he was late Roman Empire. He was actually South African.
Saint Augustine?
Yeah.
That can't be 480 because he wouldn't be referred to as saint before Christ. Right?
Oh, no, I mean 480 AD.
480 AD? Okay.
Yeah, 480 current
sense,
era,
yeah.
or common era.
Okay.
I think that's what I meant to put there instead of current era. Yeah, so there's not a ton that I need to say about St. Augustine, except that I think there's probably early seeds of like quietism in there, like very intense Christian thought, or it could be any religion, but it's the idea of sort of like venturing or stepping outside of yourself or in your worldly needs and sort of negating the world and just sort of like immersing yourself into the spiritual, type of transcendent almost, where like that becomes your sole focus. I think is a lot in quietism, and by that you actually do maintain a sense of peace, I believe. Somewhat similar to Buddhism as well. You probably see some parallels there. Yeah, so you see some more philosopher king type roles show up, like Marcus Aurelius was like a statesman, but he was also like a philosopher. He was also probably educated in other realms as well. One thing we didn't mention was Diogenes of Sinnoh, or I think it's Sinnoh. This was around the Cynics, so this was about Plato's time. But yeah, if we could step back a little bit and maybe mention him, I think he deserves a quick rundown. Give me a quick rundown of that.
You mean sit rep?
Yeah, so Diogenes was one of the early Cynics, and the Cynics were characterized by sort of a skepticism of like society as a whole, basically any adherence to any of the rule or the status quo of society was seen as sort of questionable. They question like the emphasis people put on certain things, like the value, and they thought it just complicated things, and that they thought people in their natural states, they thought that nature was enough. If man just was closely linked with his nature, then everything would be less complicated. People would be able to figure things out, but a lot of people don't have that. They're too reliant on society. So as a result,
so what, they were they were against the sort of layering on of. I think I actually recall hearing about this in the Teaching Company series lectures, but it was basically getting at that they thought that all of these realm of the forms and all these theories and systems that were created by Aristotle or Plato, et cetera, were all ridiculous and
right,
adding too much on to
overcomplicated things.
Yeah, they were layering on structures over top human nature that were artificial and didn't actually reflect how things really were, or something like that.
Yeah, in fact, Diogenes, I think, actually knew Plato, and he approached him in real life at one of his lectures, and he basically sort of quipped and made fun of him for his theory of forms and all like these, this
Oh yeah,
higher
didn't
truth.
didn't he ask him something kind of like humorous about? Or
Yeah,
no, that was Schopenhauer. Sorry, I'm thinking of something else.
but he did do something. I think I forget what it. It might have been like Plato used some type of terminal, or he used a type of metaphor, and then I think Diogenes showed up and like made fun one of his lectures, I guess, at the academy, or I guess, and sort of made fun of that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So Diogenes was nicknamed Diogenes the dog because he alluded to humans as being as they're at their best when they're like dog like. You know, like the dog doesn't need to worry about where he's gonna sleep or what he's gonna eat or what he's gonna do, or like if he has to go to the bathroom, he just does it right in front of everybody. So there is this very open, like libertine, and I use that in a sense of like of a more of like a sense of like not really having any social tact, maybe, you know. And so he was sort of like an outcast because of that, but there were still people who sort of visited him and had these conversations with him, and he did have a school going on. In fact, I think his daughter continued on the school of like cynicism and sort of carried on. But yeah, he was called Diogenes the dog, and I think we already talked about the anecdote with him and Alexander the Great, but
Yeah.
there was another one where Athenians were making fun of him, and I think they were throwing bones at him because they're like, "Oh, you refer to yourself as a dog. Well, catch this bone," and they started throwing bones at him teasingly, and at some point, no, not quite as bad, but
Yeah.
But he got up in the middle of their I think having a feast, and then he like peed on them, and he was like if like this is also dog like too, or something to that effect.
Jeez.
So there was a gap in philosophy from approximately 500 CE to about 1000 CE. Not to say that there wasn't anybody in between. It just most of it was like church centered medieval thinking was possibly limited by the common explanations of the natural and metaphysical world were already being adequately explained by the Bible and sort of the doctrine deemed accessible by the church. So if you look at a lot of like artwork from the day, a lot of it paid homage to like, you know, like the creation myth, and they pretty much didn't venture too far outside of the Bible. I mean, you probably had some like people who got a little bit more like maybe deviated away from that a little bit, but for the most part, a lot of art was very like commissioned by the church, because the church was such like especially like the papal Catholic Church was such a big part of society, was so like inextricably linked to it.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a lot of freedom to do that, but in doing that, that rose about like monkish lifestyles, monastic, very simplistic lifestyles. They were very like disciplined and like self-denying. So you had the likes of like Meister Eckhart come about, I believe, in like the 1200s. Yeah, and after that there is the Islamic Golden Age around, I believe it started out in the 12 to 1300s. I'm just going to gloss through this because I don't think there's much I can say about it. Admittedly, my knowledge isn't too sufficient on that. But essentially, I'm using like a Fox News, Bill O'Reilly vernacular. Essentially, the works of classical antiquity thinkers such as Plato, Socrates, Aristotle were rediscovered, I think, around in Baghdad. So there was like a reinvigoration of all these theories, and like curiosity and the scientific method was like sort of implemented again, and people started heralding this new type of, you know, intense thought. And there was like the hubbub, and that was mostly Baghdad, I believe, was like sort of the epicenter of that. And yeah, there was like early type of findings in science, like even like neuroscience. There's like very quite surprising like images and drawings, mock-ups of like almost what neurology, early neuroscience, and like synapses, like roughly sort of like what they look like, and they had like sort of a good grasp and understanding on that. So moving on to Saint Anselm and Thomas Aquinas, their theology, their philosophy. I want to say Anselm was a little bit earlier than Aquinas. I'm not quite sure if they were contemporaries or not, but Aquinas had his big thing was trying to sort of logically and philosophically prove a deity, not just by using the Bible. So there was a bit of a change up in people's tactics, I think. There was, instead of just referring to the Bible, he would sort of look at the natural world and look at the evidence and be like, sort of derive, like, oh yes, there is a, you know, like for example, like his unmoved mover or prim and movens theory, there's sort of this appeal to an initial like Aristotelian physics and how there has to be like an impetus, I think, and as Aristotle put it, like there has to be this outward force enacting on this object to be able to be moved, because down like causality, down like an actual line, if you go back to like, okay, so what caused this person to do this? Well, you could say they were hungry, so they went to go get something to eat. And then you could, if you sort of follow that logical route out to its sort of conclusion, if there is that, you'll find that it's recursive. Actually, there actually isn't really a conclusion. Well, that's what Aquinas is trying to say, is that, well, if you keep following down to its logical route of like, okay, so if this object moved this object, and say these stones were put in place, or like over the course of they sort of evolved, and they've been weathered down, they've been whittled down to different shapes, or you can look at sort of the scientific geological way of looking at it, like there's layers in the rocks, and like each of them sort of like signifies a different, like there's different gradations and how things age, and scientists can sort of look back on that. And Aquinas is basically saying, well, if fundamentally you're saying that everything has been moved or put in place or set in place by something else, then you're just gonna fall into this issue of infinite regress, where you keep going back and, well, this thing moved that object, and that object moved that object, and you'll keep going back, and you won't be able to find a logical like sort of start unless. And he says basically that, again, basing it off of Aristotle, his conclusion is that it's actually God that moved everything into its current place. And a lot of people have contention with that because it's too much. They see it's like too much of a leap.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like almost illogical. Like, well, who's to say it's like it has to be God that's doing that, and much less a God that of the Bible with that characteristic. And you can't make that assumption purely based off of that. At the most, you can get to something where you're like, well, yeah, there's a prime mover at the beginning of all this, but who's to know what that nature is? I mean, if it's a metaphysical nature, it's
and also
certainly not in the realm of
the logic might not even check out as far as an unmoved mover, just because I don't really per se have any problem with the idea of an unmoved mover, but the insistence that there must be an unmoved mover, I think there's some issues with that. Like, for example, if you believe that, like, you're like the whole idea is that, well, I'm just following the logic, this causes this, and this causes this, and this causes it, so obviously it must just keep going back and back and back. But at the same time, logically, it has to stop somewhere, right? So this is the unmoved mover, God. That makes sense. But then you're like, well, wait a minute. You're trying to be all logical, but then part of your answer to this mystery is that there's a being who hasn't been caused by anything else.
Yeah,
and
like
just
it defies logic still.
Yeah, like doesn't that defy logic?
Yeah.
So like you're accepting something inherently, seemingly illogical that we have no example of in the entire. To our knowledge, we have no example of something like that. Everything we see has a cause around us. Everything.
Yeah,
so now
I think
you're inserting this other thing, and it's like, it's just very muddled in that sense. Like, well, you're trying to be consistent, but then you're assuming that this fantastical thing exists that you have no explanation for.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's definitely some stretching going on there.
I think there was some. I can't remember who it was exactly, but there was somebody to recant to Aquinas's theory, and they put it basically in an allegory of somebody being. It's like two people that are in a garden together, and they're observing what's already happened with the garden, and they're logically, pretty much deductively, I guess, concluding that, well, there has to be a gardener, right? Because this garden's here and it's tended to, and like everything looks like freshly tended to. So they basically, forget what one of them said, but they basically try to follow like the sort of the logical deduction from that, like, okay, so what, like, there's no way of proving that a gardener's here, but surely there's like the stamp or like the reflection of something being here. So it like leads them to like sort of question it. And I think it's like I think at the end of it he said it's convenient how God, the only proof for all this dilemma is not visible and is not, cannot be objectively known. It's like you can't get any objective
and
like
also
data,
there's a little bit of
evidence out of it.
Fault in that logic as well, because and I'm not trying to be nitpicky here, but it's just certain things I notice. It's like when you look at a garden and it's been freshly tended, you know enough about the way the world operates and physics and how things function to know that if there's a garden that's been freshly tended to, that means somebody was doing it. It wasn't a robot, and it wasn't, well, it might have been a robot now, but like, let's say that example, hundreds of years ago or whatever, however long ago that example was, or thousands of years, it wouldn't have been a robot, and it wouldn't have been, a mouse that did it. It had to have been a person who did this. So that's like a totally reasonable assumption. Whereas when you talk about something like the entire universe being created, that's more sketchy. That is a one-off thing. As far as we know, that would be a one-off thing, totally unprecedented, and we have no reference point for what that is. You know what I mean? Like when you talk about a garden being tended to,
that's almost like a very
millions of gardens that have been
tended to.
It's
like this very unreliable type of like microcosm.
How many universes have come into existence one way or another?
Yeah, it's like this very tenuous like type of schematic that he's trying to draw up. Like this is a very logical, like reasonable model for the universe. Like this, God comes along and tends the garden. Obviously, this further provides that he's not a deistic God, and he's not dispassionate and has interrelationship.
It's very cutesy, like chain of logic.
Yeah, it's like sort of like Kent Hovind
that's respectable for like
maneuver.
2,000 years ago, but for now it's just like it just comes off as just very disingenuous and like very, very just poor logic.
Then there was Saint Anselm of Canterbury. His most well-known argument is the ontological argument for God, which, where to put the gist of it, he basically asserts with a whole, like, well, in order to prove God, we know that perfect things exist. We know that perfect things can exist in the mind. So if perfect things exist in the mind, it's not totally out of the ordinary for it to also exist in real life. And I think as
what is this argument
William
called?
Lane, it's a ontological argument for God.
Oh boy.
By Anselm.
Yes.
And I think William Lane Craig had sort of his take on it, and he was
there's
basically
been different modified versions of this.
Yeah, where he was like saying like part of it was like, I don't know if this is an original Anselm one, but like it might have just been like William Lane Craig was just adding on like cute little things, but he was like saying something to the effect of like, well, the idea of a unicorn isn't totally laughable because it's just it looks very much like a horse, and it also has like a horn on it, so it's like it's not totally out of the ordinary. It's like it's in a perfect world. I think that's what they keep going back to, is like in a supremely perfect world it would exist. Now knowing that God
mean, though?
in like a totally perfect world, and then I think they basically like well we can all agree that God, the idea of God, let's define him as the best of all perfect things. I think the magnum opus, the best of all possible worlds. Well, if that's possible, if both supremely perfect things such as unicorns, like that we can imagine, we know them to both appear in our head and in the real world as well, because like it's not out of bounds to believe to see a unicorn, and then it's like therefore God exists, because in a supremely perfect world he'd have to exist because he's all good and he's all let me look at the actual point just to make sure I'm not misrepresenting.
Let me just say a couple things.
Points.
First off, any argument that starts off with some kind of statement like, well, if a perfect being is conceivable, and we'd all agree that God is the most perfect possible being in all possible worlds, like you know right off the bat you're getting into some very wacko cutesy argument kind of territory. Like you can make all kinds of things sound really logical. Like, well, I mean, the logic is solid, but then really, if you just zoom out and take a step back, you're talking about like just fanciful little ideas in your head.
Yeah, they're very stretchy.
They don't comport with reality at all. They have no real analogy. Like in reality, it just doesn't. It just so doesn't check out. You know what? And also, you know what this whole argument this whole argument feels like some kind of sleight of hand trick, doesn't it? You know what I mean? It sounds like a verbal...
Like they're trying to sneak in God.
Yeah, it sounds like a verbal sleight of hand trick.
Via the appeal of logic.
Where you layer on, step by step, well, premise A and premise B, well, therefore, this ridiculous thing must be true. And you're like, well, wait a minute, something's going on here. And you can't quite figure out what it is, but you know something wrong. You know what this reminds you of, though, again? It reminds me of the Abbott and Costello math problem. I just find the ontological argument and basically every version of it just really hilariously bad.
Yeah.
Hilariously bad and
Well,
embarrassing.
here's the 6 points of Anselm's summarized
Lay it on
argument.
me.
Number 1, it is a conceptual truth, or so to speak, true by definition, that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. That is, the greatest possible being that can be imagined. Number 2,
Nice.
God exists as an idea in the mind. Number 3, a being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is other beings equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. Thus, number 4, thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we
He's
can
not the
imagine
possible greatest being.
something that is greater than God, that is the greatest possible being that does exist. Because even then you're sort of sneaking that in. It's like the greatest possible being that does exist. You're assuming still. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, for it is a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being greater than the greatest possible being that can be imagined. Number 6, therefore God exists.
Yeah, there's just definitely some kind of sleight of hand going on there, even if it's unintentional.
Because you're assuming you're taking this great leap of faith to assume that, well, God exists as an idea in the mind, right? And then you're like, yes. So, but if he's the greatest possible thing, and it's not, come on, it's not, it's like doing that thing where you're like, it's not unreasonable to think that maybe there's something you can imagine can be great, a great
but like,
possible
how do you,
things,
but,
and
but
also
even,
exist
but even this
outside the mind, in
conceptual
reality
greatest,
too.
it's like, yes, I can conceive of a being that is the greatest possible being and exists in real life and exists in my head.
Mhm.
But currently that idea is just still only in my head.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
I
there's
think
no,
somebody like
you can't make that jump.
somebody was like, you could pretty much say this about anything, like
Yeah.
like
By the way,
like
that
pizza
format,
or something. It's like, therefore pizza exists. It's because it's like the greatest of all best possible worlds, and it can exist in the mind, being that exists
it's like
in
that,
the mind of reality.
and I love that approach. I guess you could. It's sort of like a reductio, kind of, but it's not quite. It's like the taking the approach of, okay, here's this logical system.
Yeah,
that's
and
been,
applying it to other
yeah.
venues,
Like let's try
aspects.
applying this to other things and see what type of result we get. And then you apply it to something totally ridiculous, or you apply it to something not ridiculous, but then you end up getting a ridiculous result that's obviously not true, and you're like, no, this isn't gonna work. If something, if something can be, if some kind of logic can be applied to other things, and you get ridiculous results out of it, that's a pretty good, proof that it's not a great argument.
Yeah.
In my book.
So I guess we can move on. We totally owned the ontological argument hard. No, just kidding. But
Ontological arguments gets owned.
Yeah. Destroys. Ben Shapiro owns a Honda Element.
I love that.
So probably within a couple hundred years after that, there was the Renaissance, and again a recrudescence of like Greek ideas, of like aesthetic and beauty. There's still like a lot of religious influence too, but it was like certainly, it was almost like a little bit like a bit of like a prelude to the Enlightenment, but it was more like romantic and more art centered. But there's a lot of like scientific thing obviously going on, innovations and ideas. But yeah, there's a lot of philosophers around then. I suppose you could say Michel de Montaigne and the French moralists could fit into that. I mean, they would still probably be 1500s. I mean, late 15 to early 1600s. But yeah, French moralists sought to prescribe methods on how one ought to conduct themselves and behave in the world via aphorisms and like descriptive rules. Notable moralists were François de la Rochefoucauld, and I could be pronouncing that wrong because like
Foucault,
there's like
you mean?
no,
guy
not
that
Michel
Peters-
Foucault.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
100 years earlier, but there's like a weird way of saying the part like Rochefoucauld, like French is like very like breathy.
Dragonbach.
Yeah, Brock. Yeah, he sort of like criticized like French noble aristocratic upper class life and pointed out like problems in like hypocrisy a lot of the times, and sought for like a more of an honest, upstanding way of living. And aphorisms supposed to like have like a punchline a lot of times, like so you'll note a lot of these writers popularized like the essays, like, you know, Michel de Montaigne had his own essays, Blaise Pascal had his Pensies, though he was noted for incorporating Christianity into like more of a logical, pragmatic framework. Like there's obviously Pascal's wager, no doubt a brilliant philosopher, but a lot of people have issues, I know, with Pascal's wager, where it again sort of like the ontological argument, it sort of runs into that issue, like, you know, Aquinas and a natural law theory and all that. It sort of runs into the issue again of just sort of sneaking in a specific thing or assuming too much. I mean, it's definitely like a good thought-provoking thing with Pascal's wager. I mean, if you're ruminating and you're thinking on like there being like a teleological purpose to everything, and you're like, well, it's better to gain everything, or, you know, it's better to rope in with God than to like, you know, because if God is false, you know, it's like you only have paid your life, and it would have been a well-lived life. But if you live your life without God and choose instead to, you know, without belief, it's like you have your whole entire like eternity to pay for, which I think is still like this thing where it's like, yeah, but I don't want to wager in a almost utilitarian almost way of like,
yeah, and that's
well,
not
like,
even
you could,
consistent with a Christian worldview.
like, what do you? It's almost like you're saying,
anyway.
what do you have to lose if you go with if you rope in with God, if you just have trust in Him?
And you don't find that logic in Christianity at all. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
At
there
least
seems
I
to
don't
be
see it.
there seems to be like, well, we'll get into Kierkegaard later, but like more of this God's demand seems, or the way that God, you know, Yahweh in the Old Testament, it doesn't seem to fit into this, like, you can't pigeonhole that into like this, well, like this, and, you know, if it doesn't seem like it's like this bargain that you have to make. But yeah, I mean, it has like some good questions to start off with, but I just don't, it sort of like drains the life. That it brings you to this like sort of, well, like Nietzsche said about like you sort of denying the world, or like Christians denying the world, or the religious in general, in favor of something that's not fully proven. They sort of like live these lives, and like, you know, it's like they're throwing it away almost. So it's like you're running into this thing where like, are you ready to give your life to, you know, to something that big?
Yeah, and then there's also the applying the logic to other things. Like, why can't you also say like, well, let's make a wager that the Mormon God is real, you know? Now, do you really want to go to hell for the rest of your life for not believing in the Mormon God? Or would you rather throw in him? You may as well throw in him, because da-da-da-da, and it's
that leads you to the great
all
big
of a sudden
thing,
you're like,
and,
wait
which,
a minute.
Well,
like,
wait a second. Like, who's to say that,
what
you
if you applied this thing to every single, like the Islamic God and the other God and the other God? So like, now you're like, well, wait a minute.
Because
which do I wager is the
best
the
of
real
all possible
one?
gods?
Which one is the real one?
The best of all possible.
Which one do I throw in with?
Yeah, it just leads you into this, like, again, this regress. Right around the 1600s, there was rationalists. There was a trio of Leibniz. He might be Leibniz, I'm not sure.
What era is this? 1700s?
I'd say mid to, like, maybe mid 1600s to, like, early 1700s.
Okay.
With Leibniz, Descartes, Spinoza. Hume was around the same time, David Hume. Leibniz also had, I believe, a very somewhat similar, at least, argument for God, and it was one of those sort of logical type of things as well. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, yeah, he had a best of all possible worlds. Was coined by German polymath Gottfried Leibniz in his 1710 work Essays de Théodicie, les bontés de Dieu. It's a very long name. Essays on the Theodicy. Yeah, Theodicy on the goodness of God and the freedom of man.
Yes, the argument.
Yeah.
You know, the argument that God can remain perfectly good, just, and moral, and also not be the author of evil, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And it's basically an explanation for how that can be true, while also there's all this evil in the world.
Yeah. In 5 statements, he says,
"Lay it on me."
God has the idea of infinitely many universes. Number 2, only one of those universes can actually exist. Number 3, God's choices are subject to the principle of sufficient reason. That is, God has reason to choose one thing or another. Number 4, God is good. Number
I
5.
love
Yeah.
that one. That
Um,
the way you read it was so like. Anyway.
Therefore, the universe that God chose to exist is the best of all possible worlds. It's that Augustine.
It's a bit of
In fact, it
cutesy
says
argumentation.
Leibniz borrowed the same idea from Augustine to fix the issue that evil, though real, is not a thing, but rather a direction away from the goodness of the one. Which also sounds very similar to the whole evil is just the absence of God.
Yeah,
in the same way that light
negation
is.
of
Yeah.
a positive thing.
And that student's name, Albert Einstein. Lay it on me.
Yeah, kind of in the same, similar to the darkness is not a thing in itself like light
Yeah.
is. It's just the absence of
negation.
light.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, it's
like,
very.
or like cold. Like
Yeah.
there's no. If I'm thinking of this correctly, there is nothing. There's no such thing as something that's like actually cold in and of itself. Like cold is not a thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
it's like a state.
Coldness is not.
In the same way that ice is like one form of water and.
Yeah, something that's very cold. That coldness is not generated by a thing, like a source of the coldness, in terms of say like heat being generated by a source of heat, like a flame.
Yeah.
But rather,
Or just like stored
coldness
energy
is
or something.
Yeah, coldness is the state of things when you have an extreme absence of a heat source or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think
Which is interesting to think that
Newton.
it seems that the natural baseline state of the universe is cold and dark, which is sort of weird.
And it's like the whole like ex nihilo, like out of nothing came something type of contention everybody has about like what the origin of the universe is. Again, it's very very convoluted territory. But yeah, it's like it reminded me sort of what little I know about Newton's thermodynamics. Like the first law of like things, if anything's set in motion or there's like a state of something not being in motion, and then there's like
things will stay in a state of
an
perpetual
unstoppable
motion
force meets
unless
an
they're
immovable
stopped.
an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. I think that's when it.
Or things in motion tend to stay in motion.
Yeah.
Something like that. I never really looked into that much, but
Yeah, but like it's interesting. Like gravity's still technically a theory, but we can see it sort of like demonstrated every day.
yeah.
So Leibniz, I think that was in the Monadology. That actually looks interesting. I'd have to look into. Yeah, it says it's a short text which sketches in some 90 paragraphs a metaphysics of simple substances or monads. A monad from the Greek monas, which means singularity, in turn from monos, which means alone, refers to in cosmogony is to the supreme. I think cosmogony. It's the supreme being, the divinity or the totality of all things. The concept was reportedly conceived by the Pythagoreans and may refer to the single source of acting alone to an indivisible origin or to both. It was adopted by later philosophers such as Leibniz, referred to as an elementary particle. Yeah, that basically sounds like, I could be wrong, but almost tantamount to what the idea of like an atom, when you break down like physically break down a material to its most basic fundamental form. I think it's pretty much just an atom, and then there's obviously like what makes up an atom too, with electrons, neutrons,
Gluons.
protons. Yeah, gluons.
Gluons.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
that was like what was it? The chick tract. That was like one of the also
oh boy.
like the gluons is like proof that there's a god too or whatever because of
Or no, the professor was like, gluons,
gotcha.
And then
he's
the
like
perfectly coiffed hair, perfect, Anglican or
paragon of
paragon of Eastern European
1950s
blue-eyed, blonde hair,
Protestant work ethic kid.
Peacefully, cordially, respectfully, and godlike retorted that gluons were basically made up.
Yeah, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Therefore, it's God because God preceded everything, and before Abraham, I am. So
Yes.
it's sort of like
solid logic on his part.
Yeah, and we're not trying to like pick on Christianity too much because. I mean, if anything, like I'm personally not militant, but it's more so just the type of arguments that show up.
Season.
Yeah,
okay. Trick tracks.
It's more so just
are on the menu.
The tactics used
for mocking.
It says that Diogenes Laertius, from the monad evolved the dyad and other monads, from numbers points two-dimensional entities. So yeah, it just sounds like not to reductivize it, but it sounds like sort of basic, almost like it could be a metaphysical take on like atoms and particles, like simple fundamental particles. And I think I was reading something else about monads, like he was saying that within monads, like there's a potential, like there's potentiality into actuality. Yeah, it says monads perceive others with varying degrees of clarity, except for God, who perceives all monads with utter clarity. So again, he's going back to like God is sort of like that unmoved mover, sort of arbiter of.
And I guess, and you know, I've reiterated
goodness.
this plenty of times, but I'll just kind of say it again. My whole thing with all of this is that it's always this thing where they mention real things that actually exist and everybody agrees upon, and then at some point they just insert supernatural or metaphysical things into the mix, and at no point do they actually demonstrate it. It's always this like tenuous, bizarre logic where you go from things that exist that we know about, and then you try to spring the other things from that. It's like, see, it's so obvious. It's so
you try to be like, well, they're trying to like shift the goalpost of the definition of what is logical, and they're trying to be like, well, clearly God can easily be incorporated into that logical thing because from him everything is good.
You would never do that the other way around. You would never like, for example, if all we knew about, I'm trying to think about a theory like okay, imagine this, like imagine if we didn't know what was in the ocean at all. We didn't know of any animals in the ocean, right? Well, you can like theorize. You could be like, you know, it could be like, well, like no one's ever gone underwater, let's say, and they're like, well, water kind of looks like, you know, it's got this reflection, you know, it's mirroring us, so it's logical to assume clearly that if we were to go under this weird liquidy surface or whatever, we would see lots of reflections everywhere because the surface is only just part of it. But if we went under the water, we would see millions of reflections. We would be reflected infinitely underneath this surface, you know, and it's like, oh my God, it all makes sense now. And
deriving,
but really, what the real way to find out what underwater is like is if you just go underwater and you're like, oh, this is what it's like. You know what I mean? Like, you know, like they're always just trying to do this weird, bizarre thing where they're like, well, there's this, and there's this, and there's this, therefore this. And you're like, I think what's happening is that you already believe in that other thing, and you're just trying to really work your way towards that.
Right. And it seems like a lot of the time there's this very, like, arduous effort to sort of get you to them trying to, like, realize, like, the descriptive world of facts, logic, modal logic, mathematics, and they're trying to get that to reconcile with the biblical world of
they'll do anything to get to their goalpost that they've already decided on beforehand.
Yeah, it's like if you like listen to like Jesus's parables, like they're so like not like you can't just describe like they're ethical, they're prescriptive, they're how one ought to live. Like he's conveying like a universal ultimate truth. And it's like you're trying to derive from that, like this, you can't like descriptively say, I don't know, you can't just use man-made, you know, like the world of just like descriptive facts and stuff, they're coming from different places. Not to say they can't ever meet or overlap or coterminous in any way, but it's just like, I don't know, it's like you're trying to derive one out of the other, like this, like, I don't know. You're trying to get them to be like reconcilable and like it makes perfect sense, and you start changing like the goalposts of like what logical actually can include this, like God now, and it's like now that's in the vernacular and in the definitional, well, now that God is this, it logically follows suit that like this also, you know.
Yeah, and a lot of this, what it comes down to is just, this is all just a bunch of stuff in people's heads. Like, you know, when I'm in my room, this room is not in my head, you know, we're borrowing any sort of like solipsistic type of stuff. I don't think that that's legitimate at all. Like, I don't think there's any merit to that kind of thinking. But
yeah, it's one of those sort of like margins of doubt. Well, we don't know for sure. Like objectively, it's like,
and a lot of it. Like here's another thing, and this ties into the idea. I'm not sure if you've heard of this before. The concept of divine hiddenness. Have you ever heard of that?
Divine hiddenness?
Yeah, divine hiddenness is just the idea, and I think it's a fairly old type of, you know, train of thought or whatever, not school of thought, but, you know, just concept. It's just the idea that...
Like a theological concept?
Yeah, well, it's related to theology or whatever. It's just the idea of why does God appear like he's hiding? Like, you know what I mean? Like, in other words, why is he not visible like we're visible?
Isn't there a whole...
Why does he not appear...
Isn't there like a branch of theology called theosophy, where it's like an appearance
Uh,
of God in
theophany.
theophany.
Well, theophanies are just appearances of God, like in the Bible. Let's say.
Yeah.
Well, that's one example. But you can
Yeah.
have a theophany that's not related to that.
There's also hierophanies, I think.
Oh boy.
Where I don't know if this. I think this could apply not to just the Bible, but like myths in general could extend to all myths. And I think it was Mircea Eliade who sort of was like a proponent of it. I could be wrong, but like, and he was the one that sort of like came up with a sacred and profane dichotomy.
Oh right.
I think basically like a hierophany is like the appearance. Not only are these myths like intimating or hinting at like a transcendent type of otherworldly power, but it's also taking part in them, or it has the power to take part in them.
What is it? What do you mean?
I think sort of insinuating that like, well, these other powers that they talk, like an oracle, for example, like a Greek oracle at Delphi, it could be that there's actually these like otherworldly sort of like these things are actually taking part in it, like they actually like they're not it's not just this metaphorical type of allegory anymore, like now it's like an actual appearance of these things,
Okay.
of like mystical entities.
And you get what I'm talking about with the concept of divine hiddenness.
Yeah.
Is like just like if you just take a step back, you're like, why do all these arguments? Why do they have to, like, the whole reason why all these convoluted ontological arguments and all this stuff, the whole reason why you have to go in these ridiculous pseudo-logical circles, just on and on and on, just these bloated, stacking on of layers. Well, if this, therefore that, therefore this, therefore it's only reasonable to believe.
And if it's so self-evident too, why do you have to go through this?
Why are these arguments even required? Well, I'll tell you why these arguments are required when they're not required to prove that deer exist. Yeah. Because we can just look at deer and just touch them and feel them, like, oh, there they are.
The whole faith thing too. It's like, well, if I can just logically prove that God exists, and if it's so self-evident, what is the use of faith anymore?
Well, yeah, and then that ties into why is this system even why is this the selected system by God or whatever? You know what I mean? Like, why would this be?
Well, if it derives from God,
it seems like such a terrible.
And then there's the whole thing where, well, if it's derived by God and God is known to be utterly good, and
then it must
by
be perfect.
definition, then that must be perfect too. Anything that comes from God must be.
And it's like, well, how's it perfect? Well, we don't know how it's perfect, but we know it's perfect. And you're like, I can literally observe this and just come up with reasons why it's not perfect. Yeah, well, you must be wrong then. You're like, oh, okay, whatever. You just kind of give up at that point. Like, oh, whatever. I guess I'm wrong. Like, it's just, the whole thing is just so overly convenient.
So the Enlightenment provoked both freedom of thought, spread of rationality, but also sort of ill-fatedly became the impetus for senseless killings under the likes of the French Revolution Jacobins, and became sort of the springboard for a lot of consequentialist utopian type ideas of perfect societies, where, be it agrarian socialism used by Pol Pot that ended in the death of millions, or probably the better known Lenin or the Marxist Lenin catastrophes in the Soviet Union, starting with the Bolshevik Revolution, proposed initially. I think Mikhail Bakunin was a big proponent, and Peter Kropotkin, I think, started out with like these ideas. Like, they're around the same time as Karl Marx too, sort of early to late 1800s, and and this was quite a time for like the Enlightenment to sort of boil up. So, and there's a lot of good things that came out of it. I think the Enlightenment was just it swung too far in the opposite direction, because it was such this visceral reaction to these horrible, understandably, perceptively horrible things that were going on at the time. Like, I mean, like, royalty is like rarely a good thing. There was like serfdom in Russia to like the mid 1800s. There was just like all sorts of just people started questioning sort of the foundation of their belief, because it was commonly stated that royalty would be derived from God, and God would be the arbitrator of like above you have, you know, God, and then directly under God you have like the kings and the queens or lords, and directly under that you'd have like other sort of subsidiaries of divisions of different gradations of power, I guess, maybe dukes and lords and princes, and you have this whole entire sort of bureaucracy, not quite a bureaucracy, but just sort of like this arbitrary, like, well, he's royal blood and he's this. And it's interesting because in the Napoleon mini series, it was like this, it looks like a lot of it boiled down to sort of Napoleon's, like, his decision had to like boil down to like sort of like who he'd marry. So like he'd like I think he actually like, I don't know if he divorced his wife, but like his wife, he basically like split up with her and then ended up marrying this other, and I think he was having an affair with her anyway. I think it was like maybe one of the French princesses. She was like very high up in French nobility, or not French, I think she was maybe Polish or some Eastern European territory he was trying to get on good terms with. But basically it just seemed like a lot of the whole like negotiating you had to do and like sort of these compromises you had to make just didn't, you could get why people might see them as these sort of arbitrary or just like a waste of time, or just like there's no like there's no merit to it, like, oh, my, you know, this is my son and he inherits everything I have. And it's like there just doesn't seem like, I guess maybe on a private owned land level that makes sense, like, okay, my son inherits this or my daughter inherits it, but there just seems to be like, you know, and obviously like the inbreeding that, like, especially with like English royalty to procure the right, you know,
to
bloodline,
procure the next Trogenbach.
the next, that's where the Habsburg jaw comes from, you know, like the jaw with like that looked like Mark Zuckerberg to be like, there was like a kid was floating around that like this 17th century like duke looks like Mark Zuckerberg, because it was
even
basically
the
they inbreeded so much. They inbreeded so much that their jaws ended up being like sort of out of whack.
Jeez.
I think, yeah, so what I was trying to say with my limited knowledge is basically the Enlightenment was trying to get at these, it was basically like the dare to know was the whole like mantra of the Enlightenment. It was like people were like now opening up their minds, like they were questioning the value system brought down like kings and queens, like they questioned sort of like just the sovereignty of it, the veracity of it, and they began to be more critical of things, and they began, that's why you see a lot of esoteric secret societies pop up around Enlightenment time, like notably the Illuminati or Rosicrucianism. It's because there was like something very enamoring about like esoteric hidden knowledge, and like, ooh, like alchemy. You might see like, I'm sure it started earlier than that, but sort of like research, like all these things about like, ooh, like changing, like different sciences, different like nomenclatures, and, you know, different varieties of different sciences started popping up. And actually a lot of the founding fathers were Enlightenment, or sort of in some way or another tied to the Enlightenment, especially Benjamin Franklin. He was probably the most sort of notorious for going to and from France and sort of going into like the Parisian cafes and societies around there. This was probably before, maybe it was during the French Revolution, but yeah, he sort of like soaked up all these Enlightenment type of things, and then like would go back to the colonies, and it would all sort of percolate, and it sort of like Lent. That's where you saw like some of, because like it would be sort of daft to say that all of them were sort of equally sort of Enlightenment bound or Enlightenment tenets to that, because you could very well say that a good number of them were Christian, but
fathers.
Yeah, but there was many of them made a clear distinction. Like I think it was Thomas Jefferson was like, I don't know if it was he was like writing letters sort of back and forth with James Madison maybe, or it might have been another founding father, because I think it was around the time they were like writing the Constitution, and he was trying to make very clear, like adamantly clear, that he didn't want it to be overrun. Like he didn't want it to turn into like this very central church-centered power where the church all of a sudden just has full control and can just yield it, and you have like the Spanish Inquisition type of thing happening, and you just have like this, you know, hapless amount of control on the part of the church. Like he was very clear, like, no, we need separation of church and state, because this isn't it's not an anti-religious statement. He didn't say this word for word, but like from what I'm getting out of it. It didn't seem like it was this anti-religious statement, like, no, it's this, like, I just don't like Christianity. It was more so, it's not that I don't like Christianity or that it's anathema. It's just that so many times religions, anytime you get like centralized, localized control, it becomes this, again, the consequentialist type of measure being used. Like, if the new decree by the Pope makes it okay to kill heretics, to persecute heretics, to extract confessions out of people, then anything is open. Torture them, get anything, like, do whatever there is. And now that you can always parcel that out and say, like, no, this isn't a Christian doctrine, and it clearly isn't. Like, it's not. You can look in the Bible about, like, you can maybe you can sort of maybe point out many instances of, like, slavery and, like, different justifications for, like, maybe the way the Old Testament God sort of, like, wiped out whole tribes, or, like, different instances of persecution still showing up. But even then, I don't think that's enough to do what the Catholic Church a lot of the time ended up doing. And I don't want to be one to bring up the Crusades either, to say, like, oh, that was a thing, because that was just as much as a sort of a political incentive tied to it, I believe, just as much as I think. I don't think it was like this very gung-ho type of, well, we're all going to, in the name of Jesus, go kill Muslims and retame the Ottoman Empire.
I've heard the argument that some of the Crusades were a response to Muslim expansion and aggression. I don't know. I've never looked into it enough to figure out what
I think the Ottoman
real
Empire
motives
was
behind the Crusades were.
Yeah. I believe the Ottoman Empire at that time was, like, compounding and expanding a lot. It was, like, one of the biggest empires, I think. So yeah, like the Byzantine Empire, I guess, we're trying to regain that sort of post-Constantinople type, like, yeah, that sort of perfect, paragon, acropolis of Christian empire, I guess. Because again, it's that Enlightenment thing, I guess, is showing up of like maybe what Thomas Jefferson was getting at, like any type of impetus or motivation to sort of wield any type of ideological power. You get like these ideologues. When people identify, this is why existentialism is like such a valuable movement or school of thought, is that when people start identifying with with a group or a group mentality, or they think as a group, and I believe like sociology, like there's like sociological, maybe anthropological terms that sort of display like how societies can sort of amass, and there is like a type of like, there's like a tribe mentality, there's like a, like you can say like maybe very very general, like very conjecturally say that, oh, like maybe French people have a way, like the average French person sort of acts like this, but on a very very general superficial level. But like you can say that about different ethnicities, but like there's like seems to be like sort of a heart and a manifestation of that. So it's not to say that you have to be a 100% individual, but like there's that Hegelian dialectic where you have to sort of whittle it down to some like form of truth that's not in any one way like dogmatic or partial to one way of thinking. Like you have to sort of get it down to like a sort of a good, healthy, not necessarily like a Goldilocks center, like a principle, like like the medium between two extremes, but you'll often find like a good centrist type of position on a lot of things actually do somehow work out a lot of times. But I think like a good analyzed like centrist type of thing does work on some of those issues. I just think, yeah, anytime there's too much influence with one person, or if there's like a idol worship almost, like with what was going on with Stalin, where they conjured up this sort of religious, almost sacrosanct image of him, like an icon, really. Yeah, like you just get to this very unhealthy type of state, which happens. I just think there has to be some. That's my problem with the Enlightenment, is that even though it was sort of a spread of rationality, spread of ideas, I think it was too loose, and it didn't have, like, it was too like, ooh, these ideas. It never came to like a tangible type of like buck stops here. Like, okay, well, we need to implement. It needed like a healthy dose of morality coming from somewhere, because because of that type of credo, like dare to know, it turns into this thing where, like, well, if what we're trying to do is procure this next 100, 200, maybe millennia, if we're trying to ensure that our future progeny are born into like a enlightened, modern, rational society, then we can kill as many French noblemen as we want.
Yeah, and
guillotine
and
everybody.
honestly, I feel like that any system, of government or whatever that's looking ahead like a
Yeah, with a
1,000 years
consequentialist wager.
is
Yeah,
any one that's looking ahead like a thousand years,
yeah,
1,000 year Reich, is usually pretty off base and ridiculous. Like
yeah.
it's
There's
kind of
no way
hard
you
to.
can map out
Yeah, like
that long.
I think it would be only be reasonable to maybe look ahead like the next 50 to 100 years or so. Like that's kind of reasonable, I'd say. When you start getting to like 500 years or 1,000 years, it starts getting a little like ridiculous to
Yeah.
think that you could predict like you don't even know if your country's going to
Yeah,
be
and you
in the
can't
same exist
just
in the same
implement.
form.
You can't just assert this axiomatic like modus operandi, just way of thinking, and like this will be the one all cure, like you had with utilitarianism, and which started with Jeremy Bentham, and he actually had a calculus called the philosophic calculus, where he'd actually map out how to measure the degrees, like the very specific degrees between pleasure and pain.
Uh,
And he actually had like a poem that he had that he wrote along with the calculus, but I'll try to find it. Yeah, the philosophic calculus, an algorithm formulated by utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Was for the calculating the degree of the amount of pleasure that for a specific action is likely to cause. Bentham, an ethical hedonist, believed the moral rightness or wrongness of an action to be a function of the amount of pleasure or pain that it produced. And we all know right off the bat, simply viewing morality, especially maybe anything more complex than like well-being, like basic well-being, or like basic maybe self-care or whatever, cannot be mapped out or determined just by how much pleasure and pain does it, because there's so much more that it's missing. It's like it's not. This is why Nietzsche, I think, like resented it, and I think he called like John Stuart Mill like a blockhead or something. But basically, like, you find a lot of English. I'm not gonna like try to attribute only English philosophers were utilitarian and positivist, but you find like there's a long line: Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and like going venturing into like the 1900s with like G. Moore and Bertrand Russell. They all were, maybe they weren't as crazy on utilitarianism, but like there was definitely this type of positivist, very like reductivist type of belief of the universe. Like the universe is in one way only. It's material. It's this. There's nothing subjective. There's no Numenon. There's no spooky Kantian / Schopenhauer / Fichte type subjective knowledge of objective things. Like we don't like. And I get how getting lost in that like loose sort of spooky land of subjective knowledge and stuff can be like things in themselves, like leads you into like a regressive nihilistic type of thing. But definitely I'd rather take like a more speculative type of view rather than like that, as opposed to just like this like pain and pleasure, like simply just thinking of like the highest good. And like in utilitarianism, like there's so much you don't know
it's
too.
just groundwork being laid that's necessary, but eventually gets wiped away by something superior. Like that like I said, that kind of conception is just way too simplistic.
Yeah, it's like starting out with it surely is using some type of scientific method, right? Like inquiry, like deductive, like the whole Francis Bacon type of inductive, deductive reasoning. Like he basically says like, number 1, intensity. How strong is the pleasure? Number 2, duration. How long will the pleasure last? Like this is like a rule book for Marquis de Sade. Certainty and uncertainty. How likely or unlikely is it that the pleasure will occur? 4, propinquity or remoteness. How soon will the pleasure occur? Fecundity, the probability that the action will be followed by sensations of the same kind. 6, purity, the probability that it will not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind. Number 7, extent, how many people will be affected? So it's like this whole entire like, we've logically mapped it out. The certainty, the intensity, the duration, how long it will last. We got it down to the T of like what pleasure is and how to make it, to propagate it and to make it gospel, and like it doesn't. And it leads you like into
life
that
and human
hedonistic
beings do not operate
liberty.
like that.
Yeah, like nobody it's like one facet of like life. Like it's like sort of like leaving you with that without like a Kantian categorical imperative where you're like, well, I'm a watch thief. So the best way I derive pleasure is from the thievery of watches. It gives me
Yeah.
the best pleasure in the world. So, in accordance with my nature, the most logical thing for me to do is just to keep stealing more watches, and just like keep like
Yeah.
the propensity and the preponderance and the propinquity of that, and to like you can scientifically map that out. So I think that's a good maybe starting point to maybe assert that just because something has like a scientific ring or a logician's tone to it, or it doesn't mean that it's like necessarily you can derive something moral out of it. And then his little poem called Mnemonic Doggerel. Intense, long, certain, speedy, fruitful, pure, such marks and pleasure in pains endure. If let it be public, why let them extend? Such pains avoid, whether it be thy view. If pains come, let them extend to few. It's like, and then the whole entire like Stoic way or a Buddhist way, which is more honest to the human condition and like how humans work, is the fact that we know for a fact that most human beings, if they just had their pleasure, even well-being, even like some spiritual needs met, there's just going to be this vacancy, and there's just going to be this drive to just be like, well, what's the next thing, you know? And
like Gordon Ramsay with the one video where he was trying to meditate.
Oh yeah, like he was
5 minutes.
5 minutes, like 10 minutes, like I'm losing my mind, like thinking about like food critics. And yeah, I mean, I guess maybe he wasn't primed for meditation, or maybe he went in with the wrong idea, and he could have been playing it up for the show maybe. But yeah, I wish he would have made it. Maybe it did seem a little bit like unfortunate, like how he sort of insulted it, like, oh, I could get all this. It's sort of like you're not grasping meditation. Like the point of it is that you can let those thoughts come, but you're not letting them like define you, or you're not identifying with thoughts, and you're sort of like letting them pass like a cloud would pass. So it's like, it's not like it's like a self-discipline where you're like, no, like bad thought, like I can't think that, and you're like, because you know with like intrusive thoughts, it's like the more you think about it, sort of like the more it's like this negative suggestion psychological type of thing where like the more you sort of want to know.
Yeah.
So it's more like just like a state, again, like sort of that ataraxia type of unperturbed. And it's hard to sort of like figure like what a good middle ground with meditation is, because there's the whole like creative, like, well, I want to be creative, but like maybe the big part of being creative is reading all these books and identifying and knowing and absorbing all this info, but at the same time it's sort of hard not to identify with what you're absorbing in. I mean, you can read it dispassionately, you can be mindful of what you're reading, but at the same time, like me personally, like I don't actually, it's very hard for me to like separate all those things.
Yeah.
So, but like meditation definitely does help though.